The next major development in the scholarship begins with Lester Bush, who first weighs in on this racial restriction of the priesthood in winter 1969. There, he wrote an extensive review of Stephen Taggart's 1970 book, Mormonism's Negro Policy, Social and Historical Origins, which argued for a social historical origin, not divine revelation or scriptural interpretation, dating the church's teachings on race to the Missouri period, which was an effort to appease slaveholders. Now, you might be wondering how a winter 1969 issue could review a 1970 published book. It's because dialogue was often behind schedule. Anyway, the social historical hypothesis was gaining ground among the intellectual class in the church, and Lester Bush would become one of the most important spokespeople. But this early review sketched out some of his own ideas. Bush's contribution to the scholarship culminates in his spring 1973 article, one of the most famous ever published in dialogue, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and Historical Overview. Bush's article lays out neatly not only the socio-historical case, but also pushes the origins of the doctrine away from Joseph Smith's time at all, definitively ending the Missouri hypothesis. Instead, Bush locates its origins squarely in Brigham Young's purview. He tells the stories of several early black converts, especially Elijah Abel, who had been ordained by Joseph Smith to the Melchizedek priesthood. It was only after Abel's death in the early 1900s that a concerted forgetting began to establish an exclusion policy. The article brings the issue all the way up to David O. McKay period and ends with several questions about the past and future fate of the church's teachings, expressing the view that new revelation was needed to answer those questions. Now, before this article was published in 1972, Bush had produced a very long draft of his research on the topic and circulated it among a few friends. That draft made its way into the hands of Boyd K. Packer, a new and conservative apostle who often found historians and dialogue in his crosshairs. He started corresponding with Bush on the topic. Once Bush circulated a near final draft of the paper to senior leaders of the church, Packer reached out again, urging him not to publish it until after he could meet with one of the apostles, a difficult task since Bush was stationed in Vietnam. When Packer and Bush did meet, Packer expressed disappointment that the article was published in Dialogue because it would, quote, lead to its use against the church. In fact, the editor of Dialogue at the time was pressured not to publish it at all and warned of trouble. Nothing ever happened to Dialogue or its editor, or Bush. In fact, the article was well received. But that was probably aided by the fact that Dialogue chose to publish 3 commissioned responses to Bush's article in the same issue, lending a perception of balance and fairness to the topic, from Gordon Thomason, Eugene England, and Hugh Nibley. Thomason, a historian and sometimes apologist, acknowledged the angst about the topic and offered some historical and scriptural apologetics in favor of the church's exclusion. He tried to take a middle path, offering prayers for both the brethren and, quote, the day when the Lord says yes to the desires of my heart for my brothers, both black and white. Eugene England was more sermonic. He compared the whole affair to Abraham's sacrifice, calling the racial teachings of the church, quote, the Mormon cross. It was suffering for all involved. He said, quote, the policy of denying blacks the priesthood is rationally untenable from all perspectives but one, ecclesiastical authority. That outweighs all others. He saw the whole affair as a test for loyalty from many of the more liberal members who were both unconvinced of the justice or correctness of the church's teachings, but committed to trusting the leadership and trusting revelation. Quote, I believe that historical conditions in our country essentially unique to the world, including resultant attitudes of church members, brought about a situation where it was in the best interest of all involved for the Lord to institute a lower law for us to live until we are ready to live the higher law. So even the progressive voices were attributing the policy to the Lord for the benefit of the church. Hugh Nibley's response was not his best. Of Bush's article, he wrote, quote, "This indispensable study seems strangely irrelevant the more one reads it." He says that if revelation guides the church, then the church's current policy is the result of revelation, and the only thing to do is go out and pray to get a revelation confirming it. The brethren have already studied the matter and prayed about it, he insists, and our duty is to do the same. He completely rejects the socio-historical analysis and insists that prophets don't follow the same rules. He defends the policy as not unjust at all, suggesting that it doesn't imply black inferiority at all. Honestly, this is pretty cringy. Quote, "Brigham Young said the Negro must serve. But what is so bad about serving in the light of the gospel? The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. If we really took the Lord's teachings seriously, we would be envious of the Negroes." This is not his best and probably his worst. The letters to the editor in the journal were more complimentary. Quote, "Greatly pleased with the last issue, Lester Bush's article on the blacks in the priesthood was by far the most enlightening piece I've read to date." Others went after the responses. Dr. Nibley's response was perhaps the most disappointing, probably because I've always generally admired both his scholarship and his logical thinking. It was disappointing to find him ignoring the question where his scholarship could do the most service, the validity of the claim that the Negro people are descended from Ham, and presenting a rationale for current church policy that can only be described as strange. There were opposing views. Hugh Nibley's response elevated the value of the issue considerably. Another, "Thank heavens for Brother Nibley. He's answered the critics of the church once again in his masterful response to Lester Bush." Bush's article ended up being incredibly influential and contributing to a culture, even among church leaders, that, number one, Joseph Smith was not the originator of the teachings, and number two, socio-historical explanations for the origins of the practice were far stronger than scriptural ones or appeals to any revelation. These factors paved the way for Spencer W. Kimball's 1978 revelation, ending the racial exclusions on the priesthood and temple blessings. In June of that year, Kimball confirmed, quote, "The long-promised day has come when every faithful, worthy man in the church may receive the holy priesthood with power to exercise its divine authority and enjoy with his loved ones every blessing that flows therefrom, including the blessings of the temple. Accordingly, all worthy male members of the church may be ordained to the priesthood without regard for race or color."